thank you so much. Fun, wonderful to be here. So honoured to be joined by two amazing people by a real fire and in the round. This is amazing. So having spent a day at Slush looking around, can't help but feel really optimistic about tech in Europe. And it kind of feels as though startups are becoming the new establishment. I mean, we've had two royal princes on stage here at Slush. Barack Obama edited Wired magazine. You've got Pitch at the Palace in London. So our startups are now in the halls of power. And so when it comes to sort of policy questions, can we just relax? Can people like sort of me who care about lobbying governments for better policies help startups? Can we just sort of sit back a bit? Now politicians are taking this seriously.
Well, there's a lot of, I agree, there's a hype around startups. And many people will want to get some of the glamour out of it because, well, there's actually a lot of young people building really incredible stuff and following their dreams, so it's a really good story. On the other hand, I would only trust governments when they actually start purchasing from startups. So if they really adjust their public procurement rules to be more innovative, then you can say that the government is actually really got the real picture. Otherwise, it's maybe more window dressing.
No, I think you're right. And every politician can claim to support startups. It's nice to go and do a photo op or something or announce a program of support, but what can you really achieve? Dr. Winslow started here, was an entrepreneur himself, founded a successful semiconductor, proper hard tech company, and then went into the US government. I mean, how did that feel going from being a sort of entrepreneur going into the US federal government where sort of enormous machinery and trying to affect change for small businesses?
Well, it's something that's very... I guess that is backwards because typically you have someone who leaves government and maybe goes out and works in the private sector. I started in the private sector and went into government. And the reason why I did that there were some lessons that I learned, you know, just having to work with rules and regulation. And I understood what some of the challenges were, what some of the barriers were. And so I wanted to be, to be able to work within the system to help to make some changes so that the next bunch of entrepreneurs coming up wouldn't have to go through the same challenges that I went through. I strongly believe in the private-public partnership. I believe that there's a role for government and there's a role for where government shouldn't play a role. And so what we need to do is to make sure that the entrepreneur is working with the government to let them know what they should do and not do so that the system works well for both.
I think it's... the Obama administration has shown that a remarkable ability to bring talent into the government from enterprise, so from Silicon Valley, and that's really an indication that he meant well, because I think by bringing people in like Winslow here, I think he also tried to change the culture of the agencies and become more entrepreneurial. He's invested a lot in actually public procurement and changing that around. So there, I think you have an administration that really did its best and even then, you probably can testify how difficult it is to get governments to really be pro-enterprise.
Well, I think that government by nature does not take on risk, right? I mean, I don't think that when you're a bureaucrat that you get kudos when you take risk and things not work out. Of course, I think that the opposite happens, that if you take on risk, that if you're on the cutting edge and things don't work out, then the press will say, what's wrong? Why did you do that? But we know that innovation leads regulation. So therefore, those who are on the cutting edge, they're going to be out in spaces where there aren't rules, the rules aren't properly defined. And so that's where there's conflict. I always say that regulation lags innovation. So there's always a need to catch up. And I do agree with you, there is a need to bring those who are on the cutting edge into government to help those when you're crafting rules, to make sure that the rules are flexible enough to accommodate in the future and not just looking backwards.
I think you're right. And coming from Uber, we definitely see that need for regulatory reform and the challenges that poses sometimes. But so looking around the world, what are some of the coolest or the most impactful things you think governments are doing to support startups?
Well, I think, so what the Obama administration has done on public procurement, or at least has tried to do, I think the whole tax regime in Israel, also the UK government has done quite remarkable things. This country, Finland has been quite remarkable also when it comes to all the funding, government funding instruments, and trying to simplify those and really provide the seed money for many of the startups here through TechS, and I think that's a really good example. So there are good examples everywhere.
Yeah, and I would second that too. I think that when you look at the area, especially in financing, the number one challenge that startups face is access to capital. And now what we're seeing with technology, especially with fintech, we're seeing many ways to get access to capital. Whether you're using something like, in Kenya, there's something called M-Pesa, where you can send an SMS message and you're able to do transaction. That's tremendous for those that may not have a bank account, they may not have a credit card, but yet you're able to use technology to leapfrog and to make sure that you're in the financial environment. So we're seeing technology being used for good. Of course, it's a threat to the incumbents. So the banks of the world, they're not pleased or they're not sure of where things are going. But for those who need access to capital, whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's peer-to-peer lending, there are different instruments that we're seeing really trying to address that access to capital problem.
So you touched on a really interesting point there about the kind of incumbents and potential vested interests. And they're the ones who will have had the long-standing relationships with governments. They'll have had the long-standing relationships with regulators. They work well in the system as the status quo. How can governments try and kind of have enough of an eye to the future and try and balance this sort of disruptive force, the new entrants, the sort of fintech entrepreneurs, or against the sort of the big banks, or the new entrants in fields of transportation?
Why don't you answer that question? I guess, you've got experience all over the world with an innovative company that's hitting certain regulatory boundaries. So what has been your experience? Which country has done the best job in accommodating Uber?
Sure, it's a good question. So Uber's now in over 70 countries around the world, in over 400 cities, and different governments have approached it really differently. So in the US, I think there's laws embracing ride sharing in most states, in I think over 100 jurisdictions, cities and state level. But in much of Europe, we've had more challenging times. But there's hope, because we actually want to be regulated. We just want regulation that's sort of proportionate and smart. And so if you look at Estonia and Lithuania, they've just passed some new laws, or in Lithuania it's passed, in Estonia I think it's about to pass new laws to embrace ride sharing. So the principle that one person should be able to give another person a ride across town for money. In Finland, here where we are, the government's recently just announced reforms to the transport code, which from 2018 are going to open up the transportation market. It's been hard. We've, I think, learned a lot of lessons and grown up as a company a bit, and are really now trying to tell our story better about how ride sharing and shared mobility works with public transport and can help improve solve problems for cities. Whether that's congestion, pollution.
Okay, now you're going into advertisement. So
sorry?
Now we have to stop you. You're going into
sorry.
Actually, we've done our central bank, or our financial authority has done quite an interesting experiment with sandbox approach, so that new fintech companies can basically play around with banking regulation and see how compliant they are or not. And also it is an opportunity for the authority to actually learn a bit about new developments and how regulation can adjust. And I think Singapore has done similar things. So I think that those are creating sandbox environments where innovative companies can actually communicate and work with the government to see how they are compliant, or how the rules might be adjusted to these new business models. I think those are quite interesting developments, but they're pretty new and it's quite difficult to implement at a national level.
And what I've seen, I think what has worked well, especially within the US context, is that when you craft rules and regulation, make sure that you have the players at the table, the stakeholders at the table when rules are being crafted, because it doesn't make sense for a government to craft rules that will impact startups, and those who are going to be impacted are not at the table to explain why those rules will work or not work, right? So when rules are being crafted, when I was in government, I made sure that when agencies were putting forth rules and regulation, that they had some of the industries or some of the stakeholders, especially the SMEs, the entrepreneurs, they're at the table. And I do agree with you, with the Obama administration, what we found out is that many times that those who are writing the rules were out of date in terms of in terms of having to deal with the industry. For example, when you think of a medical device, 10, 20, 15 years ago, it was basically gears and maybe plastic. But nowadays, you may have things to do with wireless or batteries. And for those who were trained in gears and mechanics, they may understand how they work. But when it comes to wireless, that's a completely different field. So you need to have those who are skilled in those areas, those who aren't just in those silos anymore, that can come in to advise how these rules should be crafted going forward. So what I found is that you got to have the stakeholders at the table to make sure that the rules are effective, and then you'll have compliance.
No, I think you're right, and things like the Office for Science and Tech Policy in the White House, as well as getting entrepreneurs into government or around the table is vital. I used to be in London. We saw this happen a lot. But I'm slightly worried now. 2016 hasn't been a great year for politics. I mean, in my personal view, we look around the world and see maybe a tide shifting. We've seen the US election. Presidential election results. We've had Brexit. I mean, is the pendulum now swinging against kind of tech entrepreneurship? Because we're a kind of community that's really internationalist, right? Sort of both for talent, for capital. We sort of look out into the world, and people from across the globe have come here to Helsinki to talk about making kind of Finland a great place to do tech. But is there now a sort of backlash, or should entrepreneurs be worried?
Well, I think what we've seen is that there are those who are in the educated community who feel that they can get the system, that they can have the system work for them, that they understand technology, and they feel that they have a role to play and that the system will work for them. But then there's a huge pool of people who feel that they don't know how technology will work for them, or they don't know if they're going to have a job. And so we're seeing a backlash. We're seeing those who are fearing the future. You know, they're fearing AI, they're fearing they're fearing the unknown. While the entrepreneur embraces the future, embraces challenges, there are some of us, of course, I believe that I'm an entrepreneur, but there are those who fear the future. And they want to go back to the past. And so that's where I think that's where I think that entrepreneurs have to do a better job of selling, no, this is going to benefit you. There's a role for you to play. This is not just an exclusive club for a few people that will benefit.
And do you think we're doing that? Are entrepreneurs, there's people sort of refer to the kind of Silicon Valley solutionists who think they can solve every problem, but are really just designing kind of new apps to solve not real problems. I mean, you were talking yesterday about the need for entrepreneurs to solve kind of real, meaty, sort of social and societal problems.
Yeah, I think there's obviously the rhetoric around the technology and replacing jobs and all that, and people that are deep into technology think that's not a problem. Obviously, if you can see what came out of the electoral processes in some countries is that people do think it's a problem, and they are disconnected with global developments and with all of this fast tech moving. So it is something that we need to be aware of. I also think anybody involved in building ecosystems or in entrepreneurial policy should make sure that the career option of an entrepreneur is open to everyone. It's not a highly educated tech environment only. You have very good entrepreneurs or business people, salespeople that don't have to be from Ivy League universities. So it has to be accessible, as one. And two, entrepreneurship should also be deployed for the good. I believe very strongly in the impact ventures. I think social impact ventures can actually deliver much more scalable and sustainable solutions to many of our global problems, and we support that entrepreneurship. Sometimes for them it's difficult to get capital. Their exits are more difficult, but I think that's something where the government can be much more open, because they are often also in public policy domains, where a collaboration with entrepreneurs could be really, really beneficial to everyone. And it's also something where you can communicate. So it's not entrepreneurship as an exclusive little club of highly educated people with a lot of capital flowing in and deploying a lot of technology on a global scale. That's not the only story. I think it's also a story about how we can do good and how we can improve our societies and make sure that they are more inclusive. And actually the former speaker was a really good example of that, how he brought, after exiting, he's now actually investing a lot into society, because I think this is one of the one of the, at least the West's biggest problems. Segregated societies, big chunks of our society that are not connected anymore. And now we're talking always about the angry white man, because that seems to be the demography that is most upset. But I think in our societies, it's also minorities from immigrant backgrounds, which if you have a Muslim name, in the Netherlands, you have about 1 in 10 chance compared to somebody who has a Dutch name to get a job. So that is a real problem for society. And if our kids are not in schools anymore where they meet each other, if we don't have, where they don't meet in sport clubs, if we don't have military service anymore where people meet, it means that you have these really, we start getting segregated groups in society. I think that is a massive problem for us, and as will lead to many instabilities in the future. And that's something we really need to be aware of.
I think that those are very good points. I think that it's important that I don't think that we have any time to waste all the talent that we have within all aspects of society. We know that knowledge is not segregated or is not isolated to any group. And that's what we see, especially in technologies these days. We know that these companies, they can't discount any group, because a breakthrough can come from any society, from any group, from any gender, from any place. And so what we got to do is to make sure that the access to sharing your knowledge and sharing your ideas has to be available. What I have been encouraged by is that the UN has come out with these 17 sustainable development goals. I think we need to do a better job of publicizing those goals, because they're just not all in high tech, they're in low tech, they're clean water and in sanitation. We need to be able to embrace people who have skills across the board. Some can write code, some cannot write code, to say that you have a role and that you can solve some of these problems, because we need to solve some of these big problems.
I'm bringing it back to the kind of sort of hard policy to help startups, so kind of procurement, tax, all these sort of regulations, the things that I think we all kind of, there's a community that almost agrees on what the answers are, what the sort of the toolkit is to try and help startups sort of around the world from a policy angle. Do we have the kind of right political institutions to do them? In Europe, there's a kind of fear that we are lagging behind. We've sort of lagged behind Silicon Valley and the US on a lot, and now we're lagging behind potentially Asia as well. And the European Commission sort of came out last week with a new startup and scale-up strategy. But to my eyes, at least, this is speaking personally, not as Uber, it seemed quite lackluster. I mean, do you think we have the institutions to really deliver the changes that are needed for startup entrepreneurs?
Well, maybe we need less institutions that are too concerned about this. But no, I've just been to China, and obviously often to Silicon Valley. And what I think we shouldn't do, we shouldn't try to copy or compare. There are elements that are good in all those systems. We are not as state-run and directive as, for instance, in China, but also Korea and Singapore. So their progress has been very kind of orchestrated, and they've had brilliant successes. But it's just not Europe. We are not like Silicon Valley with growing incredible companies, but public services are basically bust. It's incredible how these incredible companies have grown in a situation where there's a water problem, there's an education problem, and there's a healthcare problem, there's a housing problem. It's really quite striking. So that's not our system, and we don't have a kind of a self-governing ecosystem beyond the government. So our governments are important. You see the involvement of the government, for instance, in Estonia, but also here in Finland. You can see the government can actually play a really important role, but also in Israel. And I think that's more the model that we should look for, where the government should, in some ways, try to retract a bit, not have too many rules, not to be burdensome, and not trying to be try to design everything, because they're not capable of doing so. That's on one side. And on the other hand, be more supportive of entrepreneurship, more open to innovation, to a certain degree of risk-taking. And all of that is really not difficult. It's a choice. There's no reason why this would not be happening in Europe. In the UK, I did projects or studies this was in the early 2000s, where the UK had identified innovation as a real gap. And they were really down on all the benchmarks on innovation. And you saw that they have done a number of policy changes that have taken London up the ranks, and now everybody talks about how the UK is so entrepreneurial friendly. This is something you can do. It's really up to us. It's up to Europe as a whole, but it's also individual member states, cities, regions. They can do this. They can procure from startups. They can provide support programs. They can provide the kind of tax rules that allow you to reinvest or to write off a failed investment. This is just a choice. It's a choice for your short-term income or your long-term economic prosperity. And it's up to our governments to do so, and it's up to people like us and to you to sometimes kick around a bit so that the option becomes more clear to governments. But I don't see no reason why we shouldn't have a lot of successful companies coming out of Europe in the next 10 years or 5 years even.
I completely agree. I think that
we shouldn't agree.
Well,
we decided we would not all agree on this panel.
I disagree. What we've seen, especially within the U.S. context, is that many of the companies that are successful company, you'll see that the founder or part of the founders were immigrants. So we benefited tremendously. That the U.S. is a classic case of that if you are welcoming, that if you get access, that if you sell a story that you too can make it, it doesn't matter what your last name is, what your gender is, what skin color you are, but if you're smart, that if you buy into the system, that there's a pathway to be successful. And so I think that that's the narrative that has been spun. We in America, we teach our kids that you could become president one day. And we've shown that you can become a reality star, and in fact, things can happen, right? And so that's the narrative, or that's the story that has been told, that you don't have to stay at the bottom if you were born in a certain class. And so looking at the rules, looking at the regulation, that there's always a pathway to make it out on top.
And is it incumbent on entrepreneurs to take a part? Because before I joined Uber, I ran a non-profit in London that campaigned for policies to help startups. And one of the big challenges was engaging founders, because there are some founders who are really fascinated by policy, they care about it, they like digging into it. But for many, it's really slow, it's really complicated, they don't see enough progress, it's not really data-driven in too many cases. I mean, how do we make it? I think there's a role for government to play in making it easier for founders to be involved, but what do you think the obligation is for entrepreneurs? Should they be busy building their product, getting to market, and it's government should sort it out, or should entrepreneurs be like in the fray?
Well, I wouldn't. We tried that a lot in the European Commission, tried to bring entrepreneurs in to tell us what they needed, and often there's just no time for them, and they also don't know exactly what they need in terms of policy. So they know what they need on basis of inputs, but what kind of policy decisions you need to make, or what kind of frameworks you need to get more talent to come to your country, the kind of talent, how do you deal with migration policies versus, the bigger politics around migration. So it's really, I don't think we should ask open questions like that. I think what we can do is try to get those entrepreneurs that have exited and that are rethinking what they're doing if they're going to enter back into entrepreneurship or become an investor. So those people have seen it, and they could be the ones that are more the kind of the counterparts of policymakers. They are the ones that might have a bit more time, and then they have the financial means to actually influence policy. So those should be the voices of the entrepreneurs. They have the success story to tell. Very often politicians will be proud of them because they are their national hero, because they exited, they're big, then they have done something great, they've brought employment. So those people, yes, but on the entrepreneurs themselves, I would say let them build their businesses, and then there are people like me or the intermediaries that can try to help listen to them and bring their voices to politics, and make sure that the policymakers at least hear what's going on in the market.
I guess that I see that what we have right now, we have a problem with innovation. I think that we have a problem with both with innovation and with entrepreneurship. In terms of, we need to outline what are some of the big problems that we need to have solved, and that's why I'm so bullish on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Because right now we're seeing people, they're looking at the same problem again and again and again. We need to have more diversity in terms of solving some of the big problems that we face, right? And when I speak with entrepreneurs, they'll tell me that if they knew this was a problem, they could have solved it. And I said, well, but these are problems. You can look around and see that we're having a problem with clean water. I mean, we're going to have a major problem with clean water. We have a problem with climate change. We're going to have a problem with energy still. We're going to have a huge amount of problems. We need to solve those problems. And I don't think that the entrepreneur should wait to be told what to do. We know that the entrepreneur, he or she seeks to control his own destiny. So they need to be given the authority or not ask for authority. I think that it's said it is better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. And so they don't need to ask anything. They should just go out and solve problems, and then we'll catch up. Governments have always lagged and always will. So governments can't set the agenda. The entrepreneur sets the agenda, and government will eventually catch up.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that. It was an amazing discussion. I'm pretty sure, yes, perfectly timed.
On the dot.
So I think we're going to wrap up here, but please join me in giving a huge round of applause and thanking Prince Constantijn and Dr. Winslow Sargeant for joining us. And that was really good fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.